I'll give it 1 more minute just for allowing people. We've seen a short spike in people attending, so I'll give it 1 more minute and then we'll get started, if that's okay. In the meantime, if everyone could introduce themselves in the chat, and we'll be using a mixture of the chat room function, but also Menti to pose some questions and for our facilitated Q&A at the end of the session. I'm not sure how to react, Pete, to Brian Dolan as Yoda, and welcome Prof Dolan, obviously.
Just to put it into context, that's just the terminology myself and Brian have between us, just to lighten the mood.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll move away from the Star Wars analogies and move on to today's webinar. And it gives me great pleasure to be introducing today's webinar. It's the first of two featuring Deputy Chief Nursing Officers and really focusing on the nursing voice and nursing engagement in discharge from hospital. So today's webinar is going to focus on some feedback from a piece of work that was done by the Deputy Chief Nursing Officers, supported by ESIST and with Professor Dolan, who's on the call, where they have done a listening exercise with 3 major hospitals in Midlands and Northwest England, with a report titled No Ward Like Home. So I'm going to just start with a little bit of backdrop to the whole HOD programme, this hospital-only discharge approach, and this is part of an ESIS, the Emergency Care Improvement Support Team, support offer to the national programme that started about at the end of last year, beginning of this year, which was focused on hospital-only discharge. We supported 15 organisations through this work and others, including a series of webinars and things. And we focused our approach on 4 key themes that the organisations themselves had identified as being important for patient flow. And those 4 themes, we go on to the next slide, are not really surprising and are pretty common up and down the country, and involving the importance of frailty, the workforce challenges, the kind of nuts and bolts of what we do in our daily ward business and ward and board rounds, and then the glue, if you like, that makes the system work, the supporting operational processes, that, if you like, the bed management escalation processes around those kind of things. And we've got a series of resources now available for these 4 themes, available on our Futures platform, which we will share with you. I know, I can see from the people who have joined, many of you are already familiar with that. Can we move on to the next slide, please? One of the key parts of learning was visits to all 15 organisations as well as others, where we identified best practice and things that really help make things work. One of the key areas is the fact that when discharge is everyone's business, discharge is done well, and you can see the other areas, also key features for success in there. Now, we acknowledge just how challenging that is. I'm, as well as a regional clinical director for ESIST, by day I'm a gastroenterologist at the Royal Free in London, and I'm fully aware of the challenges that we all face on a day-to-day basis. But hopefully through today's webinar and discussion, we'll be able to explore some of those challenges and also share with you some of the best practice and opportunities for improvement. Next slide, please, if that's okay. So just a quick summary slide of the work that Charlotte and Hilary led and will be basing this webinar on. There was a commission piece of work with these organisations, and some of the learning can be has been summed up here. So what we know is small changes can have a big impact, and I'll come on to some of the data around that in the next couple of slides. But really, to make the best impact both for our staff but also importantly for our patients, it's about left shifting the time, and I'll show that what I mean by that in the next couple of slides. One of the things that we also heard, it was very apparent, is that we really need to change our narrative and importantly our language. It does tend to be rather dogmatic, tends to be sort of coached or sort of coached in blame. In my opinion, it's quite negative in terms of the historical language used. And what we hope to do as part of this webinar and future work is really focus on the impact of increased length of stay and delayed discharge, the impact on both our patients and our staff. And obviously this is timely because, I mean, we say winter's coming, but winter hasn't left as far as I can see. It got a little bit warmer in the summer, but the pressures that we normally see in winter seem to have been there throughout the summer months. So next slide, please. I'll just give you the just a couple of slides to highlight what I meant about the left shifting. Now, these are slides that actually have been true for more than 20 years. We know that there's a mismatch between demand and capacity for our beds, i.e. the demand being the number of patients admitted to hospital, the capacity and the capacity being influenced by the number of patients being discharged. Now, although it feels like there's a never-ending ask for it, what we do know is that poor flow is impacted by this mismatch. And so if we can discharge patients from the wards earlier in the day, and it often means a matter of hours rather than days, actually what you see is you can align that demand and capacity, so as demonstrated here. And we all know that intuitively. We feel it when we go to work and, in inverted commas, have a good day, because this is what happens. When we have a bad day, you see the previous slide. So today's, I'm going to close very shortly, and today's webinar is going to have sort of three main themes. So I'm going to hand over to Charlotte and Hilary in just a second, who are going to present the work on No Ward Like Home and the learning from the listening events. We're going to talk about the opportunities that we all have to improve length of stay this winter, and then we're going to open the floor up, and we're going to be using, as I say, Menti to ask some questions. So thank you very much in anticipation of your participation, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Charlotte and Hilary for the next part of the webinar. Many thanks.
To talk to myself for a couple of minutes then. Thank you, Andrew, and yeah, delighted to be here. Brian, great to see you, because I'm going to talk about your work in a minute. I'm a bit nervous when I do it justice. So do pop up, Brian, if I begin to fail, and contribute anyway. But yeah, I don't want to talk about the last 1,000 days, and some of you may know, but that this is something that Brian created. I think it was about 6 years ago, maybe wrong, but 6 or 7 years ago. And it's something that gifted it to us, because we've been working with this. You've just seen a lot about it on social media, and as we have been going around, you know, talking about it throughout the country, and indeed it underpinned our work in Act Now Home First. So just a couple of facts about this before we watch it. If you're a woman in the UK at the minute, your average life expectancy is around 83 years. For a man, 79 years. Now, if you look at the majority of people in our hospital beds, it's largely occupied by people of those ages. And tonight, just tonight, there's more than 10,000 people who actually sleep in a hospital bed, when they actually should be in their own bed, in their own home. Those are people who are in the last 1,000 days of their life. So if that was you, if that was me, where would we want to spend our last 1,000 days? Just want you to think about that as we look at this film. And this film was actually commissioned by the nursing director 5 or 6 years ago with Brian, and it was based on a poem that a nurse wrote. You may remember Molly Case. So hopefully we can get that up now and look.
The day's almost over, the sky's about to show her the first glimpse of gold over waking up dreams. The thing is, I don't know why things that I felt so concerned with just let go and drift with the breeze. I've been running around looking for answers, and all of these days there still ain't enough. Like the moonlit late plains, let the questions just hang. All I need is time with your love. I've been running around looking for answers, and all of these days there still ain't enough. There ain't enough. Time with your love.
I just wondered, I thought it's a fantastic video, and it does give the message of, you know, how precious our last 1,000 days are. I'm just wondering if we could just play the other link that Brian's put in there. That's the link I thought we were going to be playing for Molly's, based on Molly's video. Because it really does remind us of the extra things we can do in clinical practice that will make the difference, even the smallest things within a day's shift. Wonder if that's possible. Let me know if it's not. Double trees, great, thank you.
These days slip away like coins into a slot. I sit here, the person, the life, the woman that time forgot, caught between hospital bays and grey rooms that speak nothing of the life I've had. These days, always in my memory, post office and tea dance reverie, but recently hazy, as hospital wards become mazes, and I am amazed at all the ways I am lost, when once I was so found. When we kissed, so hard we felt the ground move. These days spent on the wind-swept, salt-slapped dunes by the bay. These days that seemed to go on until the horizon line, where the sea, the sun and the moon aligned, and we were just part of it, and we danced in the shallows that had never felt so cold. Until now, because these blankets are thin and my skin has not felt your warm palms in years. In here, kind faces come and go, but the weight spreads out slow and unknowable ahead. These days are spent staring at walls and lying in bed. Today they say an investigation is needed, why your heart is filling with water. A wheelchair comes, another hospital porter, who whistles old Nat King Cole songs, and I sing along all of the words that once made me strong. These days that now all blur into one. But then a nurse comes in and says, "Hello, my name is Kate, and together we're going to get you home soon." I think of the dunes, the moon and you, forever framed photographs in my front room, soon to be back again, as Kate goes on to explain. We'll get this referral sped up, the results of the scan on the way, so that you don't have to waste any more time sitting here today. These days are yours that we must help look after. Let's see if we can get your medication ordered just a little bit faster. The staff are remarkable, always here with me, yet all so busy I wonder if they forget I don't have all the time in the world. But today, something has shifted. No longer the woman that spends time in bed, my life is a horizon line still unfurling out ahead. And it leads me home to my garden. When I fall in love, drifts down the path, a single sparrow flies past, sits on the ledge and watches me, knees muddy, cup of tea growing cold, and I rise up, no longer old nor the woman who waits, but grown strong from love songs and long days spent in the sun, and stronger still from all those days yet to come, for they could be the most precious yet. So thank you for helping me to spend them well. It's something I will never forget.
Thank you, and absolutely both videos are really poignant, as somebody has commented in the chat. And Brian talks very eloquently about the currency in healthcare and the currency of time. And if we think about patients' time as a valuable currency in healthcare, it's something that really connects us in terms of our motivation and our purpose for actually getting up in the morning and choosing to do what we do each and every day. And sometimes we do recognise that when it's so busy and the work seems so relentless, it can seem that there's a plethora of policies and procedures and guidance and forms that need to be filled in to really try and increase patient flow and get patients discharged on time. And sometimes for practitioners, that can really seem overwhelming. And in the busyness of time, we can almost sometimes recognise that we can become paralysed and forget what's in our control. And sometimes it's the small things that really make a difference in terms of reducing the amount of time that people spend in hospital, time that they can ill afford to spend in hospital. So it's because of that reason that during the summer, with Brian and with the ESIS team, that myself and Charlotte decided to go out and talk to frontline clinicians, and we spoke to many people who were nurses at all stages of career, doctors, AHPs in the main, and we asked some four key questions, and that was to understand that the actual reality for patient-facing teams, primarily in discharging in patients at this really difficult time. And we went through a series of questions. So if we could go to the next slide. And the first question was, what gets in the way of giving the great care that you want to give? And you'll recognise these things as everyday pressures, I'm sure you will do, but the amount of time, you know, that we spend filling in what seems like excess paperwork, staff shortages, you know, we have to cover for other people, communication errors that we have to go back and check all the time and rectify all the times, and that's on top of the resource demands, including the bed pressures and the resource demands of inefficient community beds and perceived inefficient community services. And then the next question was, if you go to the next slide, what things waste your time as a member of staff? And there's typical things here. Waiting mainly for medications, take-home drugs, discharge letters. And there was a question here that, you know, many people coming into hospital with the medicines go home with the same medicines, yet we lock the medicines up and wait for medicines to arrive before they can go home. Duplication of roles. How many times do we have the same conversation with patients, taking histories? How many times do we have the same communication with members of staff as well? Multiple IT systems, even on one site, or people who are working across sites as well. Time to log into the systems, time to educate yourself on a system, particularly for an agency staff. And late changes as well to patients' plans and follow up to see what those changes are. And then the next question, what things waste patients' time in relation to discharge? And again, the same thing. And my husband was in hospital during the summer and he waited 6 hours for a discharge letter. There was no need for him to be in there. He said he felt he was being held hostage because of that. Waiting for reviews. People can wait days, can't they, for the right medical reviewer to come, or indeed multiple days for the physio to come round, or an LT. you'll recognise the diagnostic delays and the delays in packages of care having to be created for when people are discharged. And the things that we all know, if things aren't in place by Friday, we get the weekend paralysis. Then I think the last question, what would make the biggest impact to reduce unnecessary waiting for patients and staff to make discharge easier? Better staffing, but have that mentality that the weekend is just the similar day to Monday to Friday. And how can we absolutely have that mentality of the same speed, the same pace, the same focus? Timely drugs, reducing handoffs, clearer communication with staff and families, simplifying the processes, knowing where the duplication is, and of course the systems. Now there's some real similarities there with some of those themes coming through. So, and a lot of those themes you'll recognise yourself. So, you know, I'm probably taking your watch here and telling you what time it is. But to further go a bit deeper here, I'm just going to hand over to Pete, I think, who's going to ask some questions on Menti.
Yeah, brilliant.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Hilary. So we can ask you a question on Mentimeter. It's not very complicated. So most people are familiar with Mentimeter, but if you're not, if you pick up your phones and you put your camera on as if you're taking a picture and point it towards the QR code, you should get a little message that pops up at the top which says open menti.com in Safari. And then if you press that on your phones, you should see the last slide. And what Erica will do in a second is move it forward to ask the question. So if you can't get your phone to work, you can go to www.menti.com and enter the code 3144755. So I'm just going to leave it for about 30 seconds. So just to repeat the instructions, you get your phone as if you're taking a picture, you put your camera to the QR code, and then a little message will appear at the top of your screen which says open menti.com. And then you'll be able to see Hilary's last slide, which says listening events questions. Or you can go to www.menti.com 3144755. So I think most people will be on. So Erica, if you can take us to the first, well, we've got one questioner here, and then when Charlotte, we hand over to Charlotte, we've got another question as well. So this is a really simple question. So based on what we've heard so far from Hilary, the importance of patients' time being the greatest currency in healthcare, what are the actions, what are the things you can do, support or do to directly help save patients' time? So it's purely about what can you do to save patients' time, the things that you can do. And some people are straight out of the blocks here. So communicate better with patients and staff, organise TTOs for the day before. I like that one. Give permissions to break the rules safely. Hilary and Charlotte, your thoughts on some of the we're getting a lot of answers here. Ask them what matters to you. That's a brilliant question. What matters to the person? What are your thoughts, Hilary?
Absolutely. I love the give permissions to break the rules safely. You know, the art of the possible, and sometimes we underestimate what's actually in our control.
Yeah. One of my favourite sayings is break the rules, but don't break the law. So anyone from a nursing background, like people like myself, don't break the law, but some rules are there to be broken. And I always think they're to be broken if they're going to save patients time and do the right thing. And I always think, I'm not just talking about nursing, therapies, medicine, AHPs. Good. So quite a few coming through here. Charlotte, your thoughts?
Yeah, loads of ideas. But what really strikes me, Pete, is like there's nothing complicated here. These are things that are easy to do. I mean, I understand why they're being done. I'm not taking away from that at all. But there's nothing difficult about the things that people are saying here.
No.
So, you know, there's no reason why we couldn't start to build on some of this.
And some of them seem so obvious, don't they?
Yeah.
Sorry, Hilary.
I think Brian might remember this. We asked this: why do people have to wait for discharge letters? And one of the clinicians said because we're worried that they'll get forgotten once they walk out the door, as if people disappear. But I suppose that's the lack of confidence we've got in our IT systems.
Yeah. And Brian, just to pick on you because you're there and we know you're not shy, what are your thoughts about some of the comments?
And thank you. It's picking up Charlotte. None of this it's rocket science. It's rocket science because thankfully, because we don't run a rocket science factory. But it's some of the stuff that it's what Roy Lilly talks about. Start with the patient and work backwards. We're holding patients hostage by keeping them there for discharge. They're going home on the same medications the day they go home as they were on the day before. And then ultimately all of these things they plug into the culture. So the work is in your space to do this little stuff.
Brilliant. So we're on 14. I'll just keep an eye on the bottom right hand box because that shows us how many submissions we've got, and if that stays as it is, we'll give it another 10 seconds or so, we'll move on to Charlotte. But thank you very much here. So the great thing here is there's no surprises at all the things that work. Andy, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Pete. I mean, it's really good feedback here. I mean, I just comment on the TTO and the discharge letter sort of scenario, and we know that some organisations have actually used this to change their workforce. So there's an organisation in East Sussex that, when they looked at this, all the junior doctors were doing the discharge summaries at the end of the working day because that was the only time they felt they could do it and it wasn't a priority for them. And then they were submitting exception reports, and then they sort of reinvented and did it differently and better, arguably. I think it has become very, very challenging. The IT is not very good. That doesn't help, and physical access to IT systems. It's not just the system itself; it's the hardware, but also the continuity isn't there. So the people writing doing the documentation of the discharge summary quite often have never met the patient. And therefore they then feel clinical ownership about the information that's been put on the disc. That's quite a lot to put on, a newly qualified doctor. And I just think we, as system leaders, clinical leaders, are not very good at supporting people. We don't teach it at medical school. We don't oversee and supervise it when people are in clinical practice, and it still is the remit of the junior doctor rather than the MDT in most organisations.
Yeah. Brilliant, thanks Andy. What I'm going to do is, Erica, if we can move on now to the next slide, I'm going to hand over to Charlotte.
Thanks very much, Pete. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you this afternoon, and we're going to focus in now a little bit, I think, on one of the 10 high impact interventions that were tested during the 100-day discharge challenge, which, as you know, has just been completed, and you can see it highlighted in there. It's that a discussion about whether we should treat delayed discharges as a potential harm event. So just focusing in, and I know that colleagues on this webinar will know this, but I always think it's good to refresh and just take time to reflect on the conversations about why we all came in to do the jobs that we did, either nursing or medicine or anything of the other professions. And the reason that we all came into healthcare was to help people when they needed care, to keep them safe and to make sure that they have the best possible outcome, whatever that might be. So when people are in hospital, and I am going to refer to Brian's work quite a lot, and like Hilary, I feel a bit of a fraud when he's on the call, but I'm sure he'll have the chance to pick it up later. I want to start us in thinking about harm, thinking about deconditioning in particular. And this is Brian's mainstay work, but deconditioning isn't just about the physical deconditioning of our muscles, although that is a huge part of it. It is physical, it's psychological, and it's also functional decline. And that happens from prolonged bed rest and inactivity of our muscles. And I was thinking, we're talking mainly here about the older age group, as Hilary said, but I was actually thinking myself, even when I'm not moving, I become stiff really quickly, and it takes me a minute or two to get going. So I'm thinking my age plus 30 on top of that, what am I going to be like? You know, so we need to be encouraging activity a little bit. And when you think about people in hospital, they are either lying in bed or sitting in a chair. Occasionally they might be able to walk to the bathroom, or occasionally a visitor might come and take them for a walk, but you know, most of the time they're in bed or they're sitting. And this deconditioning process is starting, which I didn't really fully understand, on the day of admission, actually pre-admission in ED on a trolley, where people are losing their capacity, you know, their Brian talks about their aerobic capacity, equivalent of lifting a cup of tea. But and we know in that first day they can lose between 2 and 5% of muscle loss. So transfer that to 7 days, where the muscle loss might be 10%, and the impact that that has on people then going home, not able, you know, not at the level they were coming in. Now, some of that obviously is because of their condition and their reason for being in hospital. But on top of that, then that muscle wastage increases the risk of falls, and we know that people over 70 have a 3 times more likely to fall anyway. You might get increased confusion with that. People are immobile, that affects your appetite, it affects your digestive system, so suddenly their nutrition's not the same, they're not hydrated. Potential for urinary tract infection, chest infection if they're sitting, and so it goes on and on. Skin infection, other risks in hospital around hospital-acquired infection, COVID, all of that. So it goes on and on, the harm in terms of delaying people in hospital. So and then you've got isolation on top of that. So, you know, we've had restricted visiting, no visiting, limited visiting, and people don't have access to their family and friends, and the evidence is overwhelming around loneliness. 27% increased mortality risk with loneliness is worse than any physical disease you could have. So that's another reason why we should be thinking about the importance of that last 1,000 days and where people are best placed to spend that. And another very practical example in thinking about, you know, making decisions about long-term care and discharge, if we can move to the next slide, please. Delaying medications. There are particular conditions. The one that's freshest in my mind, because I've been doing some work with the Parkinson's Society, is Parkinson's patients. And Parkinson's patients, if they have a delay of 30 minutes or more in their medication, it immediately impacts on their mobility. And then we come along as healthcare professionals and we try to make assessments on people based on an unreal expectation, because they haven't had their meds, they're not feeling as confident, they are not able to do the movements that they would normally do. They probably can't even express it in the way in which we would want them to. And then we make a decision about their long-term care, which, you know, if we'd got the medicines right in the first place, it might be a totally different outcome. And I suppose one of the things that we can do very simply is to look at, you know, how we identify people with time-critical meds. It isn't just Parkinson's, but Parkinson's is a very good example of how a delay of 30 minutes impacts on a person's dignity and their ability to function so quickly. So I guess I think we in nursing need to translate this delayed discharge conversation into a clinical conversation with our colleagues in the multidisciplinary team, and back to why we all came into our professions and how we begin to focus in on the person and what's important to the person. Because I think that also brings an opportunity for us all, bearing in mind, Hilary and I fully recognise how pressurised the system is, and how difficult the workforce difficulties are at the moment. But this approach, I think, brings the opportunity to look at this in a different way, bringing a better patient experience, but also a better staff experience, because you feel that you've done something very meaningful and made a real difference to a patient. So I want to just finish by encouraging us to have those clinical conversations about the risks and the harm we are doing to patients, and how with just a little shift in our thinking we can become much more person-centred.
Brilliant, thanks Charlotte. Really powerful example, Parkinson's example. So hopefully you've all still got Mentimeter up on your phone. Eric, can you just pop up the QR code just in case anyone hasn't, or whatever, just a few seconds to remember to, it should be on your phone, but just in case it's popped off, you can take a picture of open your camera up, so if you're taking a picture, point at the QR code or enter www.menti.com with the code Low. Okay, thanks, Erica. So a question related to what we've just heard from Charlotte. So what can you do to mitigate the potential harm of delayed discharges? Or maybe phrasing it another ways, how can you embrace risk and enable a person's choice? So what are the things that we can do to mitigate the potential harm of delayed discharges? So Charlotte's talked about the physiological ones, the deconditioning, psychological ones, all the other ones, and we're going to see a word cloud form. No right or wrong answers, no judgment. So Charlotte, we've got a few words: freedom, plan, proactive, recognize it. What do you think about the recognizing? Do you think, so this is a bit of a leading question, Charlotte, but in terms of recognizing it, so what are your thoughts around people recognizing the risk of patients staying in hospital too long, or being held, or being stranded? What are your thoughts around that?
So I think that to get us to a point of recognition, because I think somewhere in our psyche, in our understanding of anatomy and physiology, we know this, you know, we do know this, but with the busyness of life and moving from one task to another and trying to, you know, mentally do 10 things at the same time, it's sometimes easier just not to have the conversation. And finding the space to do that is really difficult. So I think recognizing that this is a problem is the first step to actually taking action.
Hilary, coming to you. So someone's put the word language in. So, I mean, look, I trained as a nurse in the 1980s. You wouldn't think so because I look so youthful. But, you know, in those days, we literally kept patients in hospital for a long time. But in terms of changing the language, what are your thoughts around that, about, you know, keeping patients in for prolonged periods of time?
Yeah, and it's as Charlotte said, we don't recognise what we already know. So that language around anatomy and physiology, muscle wastage, cognitive ability. I think we tend to communicate in more managerial language, don't we? Length of stay, delayed discharges, and we forget that there's a person underneath that. And I think something that popped up in the last Menti was around communication, was what matters to you. Yeah. It's that whole personalisation of the simple thing, what matters to you, what matters to that patient. Yeah. Is really, really important. And with the multidisciplinary team, getting back to to language that centres around a person and what deterioration actually means in terms of, yeah, a person's life.
So Brian, if I could just come back in to finish, to build on what Hilary has said there. For me, this is the art and science of nursing. This is using our scientific underpinning knowledge together with the care, the compassion, the respect for individuals, and treating everybody as a human being. It's bringing those two things together, and in doing so, getting the best outcome for the patient.
Yeah, completely. And it's interesting because the bigger the word is, the more it's been mentioned. So we can see communicate, plan, risk assess. Brian, to bring you in, I can see you typing. So if you come off mute, you would expect me to put you on the spot. In terms of language and communication, I mean, this is something which you're really good at, reframing it, changing the message. What are your thoughts around this question?
Well, I'll confess I was one who brought in language, and very much thanks to Hilary pushing me, I've been thinking more and more about that stuff. And you know, it's interesting. Anytime I put up the slide I use about rethinking our framing, it often one that spins outwards. So instead of thinking, for example, about falls prevention, we have a lot of falls prevention practitioners, but that's very much a deficit model of thinking. And perhaps we should be thinking about safer mobility practitioners. Claire has kindly put in about, you know, instead of length days in hospital, people could do on the handover tomorrow, talking about people's being days away from home. Instead of reducing length of stay, it's about giving patients back time. But also what I've been thinking about of late is history taking. And that might be a hard one to move, but I'm increasingly thinking of it, it's almost like this neo-colonialist land grab of people's lives and their stories. And really, is it really about taking histories or sharing stories? because everyone comes to hospital, every patient I ever saw and at the triage desk asked them the same question, what's the story? Because they come with a story to tell. Our job as practitioners is help to translate that story into medicalese, diagnostics, nursing narratives, so we can help them. But when we talk of history taking, the patient is just simply a passive recipient and not a participant in their own story, in their own care. So they may own their sickness, but they don't own the journey of that sickness any longer because it's been taken from them.
Brilliant. Thanks, Brian, as ever, explaining stuff so simply but so eloquently. The rest of us can cover stuff some of us just can't do, like myself. Andy, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks, Brian. I just a reflection, because I think it's a really good point. The flip side being, of course, we in hospital don't see the story of as soon as the patient's left the ward. If you see what I mean, so it's almost that missing piece of the jigsaw, isn't it? And certainly in clinical practice, one of the further challenges is the assumptions we make about the levels of care or not care in the community. So which is ironic, isn't it? Because we're very happy with certain, I would argue, not good levels of care that we can see in a hospital, and yet make huge assumptions, pejorative remarks even about care that we can't see that may be excellent.
So true.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you for that Menti question. We've got one more Menti question, but before we do that, we're going to go to a summary slide with Hilary and Charlotte. But just on the trying to reframe the thing, I heard something brilliant a couple of weeks ago by a chief operating officer from Walsall, and for every patient we discharge safely and on time, we affect 5 patients. That's the patient who's discharged, the patient who needs to move from the medical assessment unit to the inpatient ward, the patient who needs to move from the emergency department to the medical assessment unit, the patient waiting outside the emergency department to the ambulance, and the undifferentiated patient waiting alone in the community. So sometimes, and I love that message, you're affecting 5 patients, and sometimes if you're on an inpatient ward, you can't feel the story. So it's just a message I heard which I thought was good. So Charlotte and Hilary, just your last summary slide, one Menti question, then I think we'll probably open up for a few questions and discussion. And Brian, if it's okay, I'll bring you into that with Charlotte and Hilary.
Suppose what I'm thinking is, obviously the people on the webinar have come to the webinar because they're motivated, but the motivation and the enthusiasm is here. I can see it. I can almost touch it and feel it through the screen, with the comments that have been posted in the chat and in the Menti questions, etc. So I think it's about taking time to reflect about how we keep that motivation going and how we translate that positive energy into action, and as we started with the start being a number of small actions makes such a big difference. And all of the suggestions that were put in the box were, as Brian said, not rocket science. So even if we took one of those things that's not rocket science and try to implement it over the next 90 days or 100 days, I'm sure that would make a difference. But the most important thing is in doing so, it's creating momentum and bringing together the multidisciplinary team to start to engage them in the conversation.
Brilliant. Thanks, Charlotte. And Hilary, anything to add?
Absolutely. I don't think I've got much more to answer that, but I suppose a question: what would help you start these conversations back in the workplace?
So Hilary is in being, Hilary and Charlotte being very bright deputy chief nursing officers for England, have preempted the question, which is good. It's like we rehearsed it, Hilary. So hopefully, hopefully you'll still have Mentimeter on your phone. If you haven't, there's the QR code. And the last question is, it's really from, Nisus, we're really pleased to be working alongside team CNO, the Chief Nursing Officers team. But what this question is really from Charlotte and Hilary. So what's the one thing we could help with? Just take that down, Eric. Oh, sorry, Erica, that you're on it, of course. So these will be of great interest to Charlotte and Hilary. So permission giving. What would be helpful from Team CNO? Realistically helpful. So, you know, we can't predict your lottery tickets or anything like that. What were your thoughts about these, Charlotte and Hilary, as they're coming up?
I'm inclined to offer a little challenge here, to say, why do we need to give permission? I don't really. I think that multidisciplinary teams, nurses on wards, charge nurse ward sisters have the authority and the responsibility and probably the accountability. But I think that, if I'm honest, we've maybe lost some of that, and we need to regain that ground. And if it takes permission to do that, I'm sure Ruth as the CNO, Hilary and myself are more than happy to support you to regain that ground, to provide any leadership that's necessary. But we are here because we want to support and empower nurses to start to make changes and to gain back some of that position and leadership for this.
Brilliant. Hilary?
Yes, support to empower nurses, leadership. And as I say, you know, we're happy to do that. I mean, and there's a variety of ways which we can do. But if you come up with how you see we can support nurses, because it's very often the nurses who are giving the care and the AHPs and the doctors that need to be listening to this and hearing this message. So is there something about how we can empower you to, yeah, would you feel comfortable doing this exercise in your own space, in your own team, in your own division? Is it something we could support you to do?
So I think what you're hearing here is from Team CNO. So, you know, our National Chief Nursing Officers team, is the permission's there, the permission to do the right thing to save patients time. We've heard it today, which is great. I'm just keeping an eye on the clock, and there's a couple of questions. So a hand up and also a question in the chat box. So Erica, if we leave the Menti running in the background and come onto full screen. So before I go to Richard, I'm just going to ask a question from Claire. Who's a colleague of mine, anaesthetist, but she's in Acosta at the moment in the Countess of Chester. So she was going to ask the question to both of you. She often finds that the nursing team are the most difficult to get to join us at the table for patient flow and safety, and they're often seen as sort of slightly separate things. So maybe patient flow is seen quite operational, and, you know, nursing may be more in the safety. How do you link them together? I think that's the question, Claire. So to Charles and Hilary, how do you link them together? How do you get that message?
Can you hear me? I don't know.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, can you? Oh, good. Okay. I'm not sure if my headphones are working. Yeah, it's been really interesting today, and as I've put in the chat, sometimes when we're working with trusts, often it's the nursing team that are the most difficult actually to get to the table. So, you know, obviously I've said that I'll share the webinar to hear it from yourselves, but I guess it's how do we get them to see that the flow and the patient safety is one thing. So we're really interested to see how you've gone around with the trust and done the work, what the plan is moving forward to go through the trust.
Okay, Charlotte.
So I'm reflecting on why it's difficult to get the nurses to the flow conversation and off the ward. And I think if we ask ourselves, we know the answer to that, and that is because they are working flat out and short-staffed, often working longer hours, unable to get meal breaks, etc. So I guess we have to find a way of bringing it to them, to bring that conversation to the ward. And I suppose that's why we're here to focus on changing the narrative to one of a clinical conversation that's about harm, because that engages.
I guess it was more I think it's the ward staff are up for it despite being under pressure. So the ward sisters are really up for that change. I guess it was more that senior nurse leadership and then engage in that level. I think the ward staff, despite the immense pressure that they're under, are still doing their best to make some improvements for the patients. So I'm on site today. I've been to the 6 wards that I'm working with, and they're still going. They're still trying to do the best, but they're not getting that senior leadership.
So I wonder, Claire, because we went in through the chief nurse of the organisation, and one of the things that the 3 chief nurses really committed to doing was to take patient flow, its alignment to risk and safety, into every team meeting that she was having, be it with her matrons, her heads of service. So it became a conversation that permeated through all the meetings that were had in the trust, because people will be gathering for divisional meetings or team meetings or whatever. It's normalising this conversation. So it's not a conversation that happens in an absolute place of crisis where people really don't understand where their role is. It's something that really is core to what people need to be doing. And I think it takes a while for people for things to percolate down into for people to realise that it is their core business, and they could be, the simple things could make a difference. And for us to be changing the language.
Okay, brilliant. Let's move on to Richard. You've got a question?
Yeah, I guess a couple of questions and comments, but not a million questions. Apologies. I think it's brilliant having the conversation. I think what this does is opens up the richness of trying to understand a bit more about why we are where we are. I think, Charlotte, your point about staff can't get out to do things is absolutely, certainly my experience of working with teams. I suppose the gap that we've probably just described, or I think we're describing when we're talking about permission, and I didn't make that comment, but I recognise it, is the difference between a chief nurse or ourselves saying we think this is a great thing, and the individual nurse on the ward trying to do the right thing, and then the site manager, and I'm not singling out the individual, coming and saying, why hasn't that patient left yet? And that's the tone, that's the narrative, that's the feel that it feels like you're being blamed for something that you should have done. And I think that immediately, certainly in the post-COVID very tired world we're in, has the opposite approach, which is basically to melt you down even more, to be more disabled about things that you could simply do. And I guess, without going on about it too much, what we've got to find is, how do we empower people? How do we give them knowledge? Because the knowledge is really key and the scientific basis is key. But how do we try and get everybody to see those simple interactions that are so, I suppose, profound and positive or negative, depending on which sort of story it is? And I guess I see that on many levels, not just in this domain, within our healthcare service, right from, the porter through to the chief exec, and none of us are trying to do a bad job. So I think how we tackle it is trying to look at that complexity, but with understanding and care and compassionate leadership. Sorry for the long-winded diatribe.
Thoughts?
I was just going to say that I don't think this is easy. And if you're being challenged about why, Charlotte McArdle hasn't been discharged before lunch and why she's still here and she should have been home yesterday and blah, blah, blah. So I think it takes courage and conviction, and it needs to be purposeful. So I think you need to purposefully say to that bed manager or whoever, the reasons that she's here is because, and be very clear about decision making and feel confident in that decision making, because you will have done the right thing. The most important is you will have done the right thing for that person, and in doing the right thing for that person you will have reduced their risks in a number of different ways. And it's trying to summarize that conversation, because the bed manager is not going to stand any longer than 30 seconds to hear it. It's trying to summarize that conversation and be convicted to the cause. And the first time will be hard, the second time will be slightly easier, but if everybody does it, they will, it will become socialized into the narrative.
Brilliant. Thanks. I'm just going to jump to Brian. So while we've got Brian on the call now, on the off chance no one knows who Brian is, so Professor Brian Dolan, just the off chance, So the creator of The Last 1,000 Days, which Hilary and Charlotte have referred to, the phraseology of patients' time is the greatest currency in healthcare, the creator, the figurehead and the starter of the NPJ paralysis movement. But Brian, one of the things you do really well is language. So are there any top tips for people from a variety of backgrounds, but this is a chief nursing officers, in terms of how we can change the language? For example, Andy's put something in the chat around, does harm exacerbate things? Any top tips around language, how we can reframe stuff?
Well, first, thank you for that very kind obituary. And actually, it's very much thanks to Pete, which is not nearly widely known enough, that NPJ paralysis Last 1,000 Days became popular in the UK. That was absolutely on Pete. And I was really struck to just circle into the word permission, because I think that's quite an important one. And NPJ paralysis was born in the outback of Australia when I wrote a tweet to Pete and others which said, Marie Riley and Tim Gillett, nursing was born in the church and raised in the army, and we put people in uniform called pajamas. Because we have this linguistic heritage of medical officer, staff nurse, auxiliary, the old ATAs, so got sister. And because of that kind of hierarchical historical baggage, people do need permission. And it does seem to me that there does need to be a letter, not just from the CNO, but from the CMO and the Chief Allied, who are, in tandem saying, you have our support, you have our permission. Accountability versus responsibility are not the same thing. And many times medical colleagues feel that they are accountable for nursing practice, but they may be responsible for the oversight of a clinical unit. And making those things clear in the kind of plain language that helps people differentiate these things, enables them to feel supported. And this is where harm comes in versus blame, and the difference between a no blame culture, where you can literally walk away with killing people, and a just culture where people know if they come to work drunk, high on drugs, do something with malice, do some with foolhardiness, putting a burr hole in somebody with a headache, then they were in trouble. But if anyone ever says, there but for the grace, then we have a system problem, and we should celebrate those things using language that moves away from harm and blame towards, we've identified a problem which we want to fix. But at the root of all these, culture comes from the Latin care. And as Michael West talks about with such eloquence, people treated with compassion give compassionate care. So the language of the transactional, why is this person still in the bed? Are we hitting the targets instead of saying, have we got standards that we're looking to meet? It does require a recalibration of language to shift the mindsets, which enable people to feel they have permission to make things happen, and that they feel trusted to do so. And that is one conversation, one heart, one mind at a time. And the last thing I would say is taking a step back. And that's down to, why does this all matter? Because if it doesn't matter what, it's simply just a task. And sometimes we forget the why amidst all of the what and the how of what we do.
Brilliant, thanks Brian. So we've come to the end of today's webinar. A huge thank you to Team CNO, to Hilary and Charlotte, our Deputy Chief Nursing Officers for England. We are delighted to be working for them. I think some of the key messages today is these people who are, some of our most senior nurses are giving us permission to do the right thing. Breaking the rules if they don't make sense, but not breaking the law, important. Thank you to Brian as well. Thank you to Andy and also Erica behind the scenes. What I would say is this is one of 2 Chief Nursing Officer webinars. The next one is on the 3rd of November, same time, 12:15 to 1:15. We will record this and send the recording out. We'll publicise the next session. So if you can encourage as many colleagues, and we're going to pick up on the conversation and develop it further. But for now, thank you to everybody who's joined, and wishing you on behalf of ESIS a happy rest of your day, and we will see you soon.